Okay, folks, so we're going to get into chapter 1, which explains what the sociological imagination is, the three major sociological theories, and how the academic discipline of sociology was established. So, what is sociology? Well, sociology is the systematic study of the relationship between the individual and society, that is, how the individual affects society and how society affects the individual. It also attempts to explain the social causes and consequences of human behavior. For example, a sociologist would look at crime and they would say, what are the social causes of that? What is causing individuals to commit crime? Is it something about the way that they're socialized? Um, is it something about the type of people that they hang around with? What are the reasons? And then we would look at the consequences of that. So, what happens when an individual commits crime? What sort of effect does that have on the rest of society? And I think this quote from your John Witt book sums it up perfectly. He says, "We influence and are influenced by the world around us." In other words, we don't exist in a vacuum. We're influencing society, and society influences us. In sociology, we also look at a broad range of institutions or structures in our society, like education, economics, family, politics, to better understand social relationships. Now, in sociology, we have 5 traditional social institutions, and the reason those are called 5 traditional social institutions are because those are the ones that can be found in virtually every society, from the most um, basic society, like a tribal society, all the way up to a very complex society like the United States. So those 5 traditional social institutions are education, the economy, religion, family, and politics. There are some newer institutions that also have become very popular among sociologists, and those are media, the military, and medical. So again, we look at how the individual is shaped by these institutions, um, and also how the individual shapes those institutions. Sociologists are also interested in all aspects of society. We don't shun away any aspect of it. So they have sociologists who look at pop culture, who study pop culture, and celebrity. They have other sociologists who do sociology of sports. They even have sociologists who just focus on subcultures. So again, we're interested in every type, every aspect of society. And then society is defined as a group of people who shape their lives in patterned ways that distinguish their group from other groups. An example of a society is an American society. Another example would be Brazilian society, but please don't confuse society with nation. A lot of people think that a nation constitutes society, and that's true most of the time. But let's say Brazil, they have the people who live in the nation, like in Rio de Janeiro or other areas of the cities, but they also have the individuals who live in the Amazon, like the tribal people, such as the Yanomamo Indians. And the Yanomamo Indians are their own society. They're not part of the larger Brazilian culture that lives in the cities. But there, you could see that there's 2 societies already coexisting within that nation of Brazil. Okay, so let's move on to the sociological imagination. When using the sociological imagination, you're attempting to explain the way that people act and think, but you're also looking at the role that social forces play in their lives and shaping who they are. Now, the sociological imagination was coined by sociologist C. Wright Mills, and this is how he summed it up. He said, "To understand social life, we must understand the intersection between biography and history." Now, what do you think that means? You should probably take 1 or 2 minutes to think about it because it is a very abstract quote. Maybe write down a reaction to it. You can pause the slide right now if you'd like and come back to it after. So what Mills was trying to say is that 1, history is an important factor in determining how people's lives play out. So think about how different your life would be if you had been born in the 1930s. What would your outlook on life be? What sort of opportunities would be available to you? What would your psychology be like? All of these things would be impacted by being born in the 1930s. And later, when you grew up and became an adult, say in your 20s, how different your life would be in the 1950s, because things change between the 1930s and the 1950s. But the way that you experience life in the 1950s all depends on your biography as well, your gender, your culture, your race. Another point that I wanted to make about the sociological imagination is that major social events have an impact on our lives. So just think about the economic recession of 2008 and how different our lives would be if the stock market had never taken a tumble. Or how different our lives would be if 9/11 never happened. We would have a completely different outlook on international policy, even on social awareness of the sorts of things that are going on in other nations in terms of trade agreements or wars. And so I think because of 9/11, we're a lot more anxious, we're more aware of what's going on in the world because it kind of forced us to be that way. Another point is that who you are, that is your biography, which could include your race, your gender, your culture, also influences how you experience the social world. Again, think about how different life would be if you were a woman born before the 1920s, which is when women got the right to vote, or if you were a minority trying to look for work in a professional field pre-civil rights movement. So your life would be very different depending on where you are on that timeline. And I want you folks to think about how your lives are affected by being on the timeline where you are right now, which is in 2016, or having been born between. Okay, so here's what researchers know about your generation. The generation, again, that was born between the 1980s to the 2000s. The first fact is that you folks are living with your parents longer, sometimes up until you're 30, whereas the norm for your parents was to leave home in their late teens, early 20s. Now, for millennials, in the year 2010, 29.9% of individuals 18 to 34 were still living with their parents. And if you look at this chart, it indicates an upward trend. In 1990, it was only about 26.5 or 26.6% of 18 to 34-year-olds living with their parents, but it definitely has gone up. Another fact to go along with this is that you folks are not buying homes till much later in life. And the reason for that could be because you folks are encumbered with debt. By the time you get out of college, you have so much debt that you have to worry about first tackling your debt, finding a career, and then buying a home. So right about now, the millennials are at the home buying age, and they're barely starting to make an impact on that market. But more often than not, millennials are renting apartments than turning to home ownership. Another thing that researchers know about your generation is that you are waiting longer to get married. So millennials have been putting off significant milestones like marriage and children. The median marriage age for the millennials is about 30 years old in 2010. And if you compare that to your parents' generation, which is the 1970s, they were getting married when they were 23 years old. And if you go even further back into the 1950s, they were getting married in their 19s, 18, 19, or even 20 years old. Another fact about your generation is that you are more conservative with your money. You don't care too much about buying these big items like homes or cars or even luxury goods. If it's not name brand, that's okay by you. You're all about getting a better deal. You're okay with ride sharing. You're okay with sharing, period. So a lot of music services have been catered to you, such as Spotify. I actually have Spotify myself. It's about $10 a month and I get to stream all the music I want. This is not an advertisement. I'm just telling you guys, for your generation, you're okay with sharing and not owning. Whereas previous generations would not like services like Spotify because they don't get to own the music. You know, they would want the physical product, like the download from iTunes. But the millennials aren't so concerned with that. So you have the rise of the sharing economy, which includes companies like Uber, where an individual can pretty much get a job as a taxi driver, and they can share their vehicle with other people. They have another type of sharing economy, which is Airbnb. I don't know if you folks have heard of that, but that is where people rent out rooms in their apartments or rooms in their homes, or even their entire homes when they're away from their houses, to complete strangers. And it's almost like a hotel service, but it's a little bit cheaper than a hotel. And again, it's people's private property that's being loaned out or rented out. So again, you guys have no problem not owning these items as long as you have access to them. Okay, so we talked about all the different things that millennials do, like living with their parents longer, they're more conservative with their money, they're waiting longer to get married, and they're putting off buying homes or making large purchases. So why is it that the millennials behave this way? I want you to think about that. I want you to use your sociological imagination and try to come up with reasons for why millennials behave in this manner. And maybe you want to take a minute or two, maybe pause the presentation here so you could try to think about the reasons that they behave in this way. Okay, so hopefully you had some time to think about all the different reasons why millennials act and think the way they do. I have a couple of reasons. The first one being the economic recession of 2008. So the reason why that economic recession affected millennials is because many of them were growing up during that time, and they witnessed people losing their homes, or they witnessed their parents' anxiety about their jobs or about the money situation, and all that anxiety was transferred on to the millennial. So many millennials have grown up anxious about the future, anxious about the economy, and that could be a reason why they decide to be more conservative with their money. The next reason I wanted to bring up was the housing cost. So the millennials are deciding to live with their parents longer, or they are deciding to rent. Now, the reason why they're doing that is because in metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, real estate has more than doubled. That is double to what their parents paid for it. So a house that you bought in the 1970s may have been worth $100,000, $200,000, while in 2016, that same house is now worth $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, depending on the area. So because of the rising housing costs, that is why millennials are deciding to rent or to live with their parents, because they just can't afford it. It's a lot different. The housing market is a lot different now than it was back in the 1970s or when their parents were young. Another reason millennials are living with their parents is because many of them are going to school. So you can see this chart here. Student loan payments are taking up a growing chunk of postgraduate millennials' income. The average graduate in 2013 was graduating with $20,000 in debt. So you're coming out of school, you're graduating with debt, you're looking for a job. It just makes sense to stay with your parents a little bit longer. And even when students start looking for a career after they graduate, it's not always easy. Many of them end up having to do unpaid internships or internships that are paid very little. So it's just not enough money to survive. So because of that, they have to go live with their parents. The last reason I wanted to bring up was the dual income parent couple. So many kids or millennials are able to stay home now because they have two parents working outside of the home. That's something that's normal now. And they're able, the mom and the dad are able to take care of their kids even when they're past 18 years old, whereas before it'd be a little bit harder to do that. But now, since you got the dual income parents, you can afford to keep your adult kids in your house for a little bit longer. And so all of those reasons are all good reasons why the millennials are facing the problems that they're facing. And if you look at even your own life using the sociological imagination, you'll see that you probably have the same set of problems. You're probably wondering, why is it that I'm still living at home and I'm 21 years old? Well, that's just normal now for the millennials. It's just a different time than when your parents were younger. So if your parents ever tell you anything, you just tell them, well, times have changed. So let's get into social theory. What is a theory? A theory is a set of statements that seeks to explain problems, actions, or behaviors. I have an example of a theory that was advanced by Emil Durkheim, which is a founder of sociology. He theorized that social forces shape individual action. So during Durkheim's time, sociology had not been established as a discipline yet. And he wanted to be the first one to establish sociology as a discipline. He wanted sociology to be taught in the universities. The only way that he could do that was to take on a study to show that there are these social facts that exist and that they have an effect on the choices that we make. So the way that he was going to prove that these social facts existed was by focusing on suicide. And he focused on suicide because it was such a private and individual act, and it would only strengthen his case. Because during that time, when people try to explain suicide, for example, they would blame this sort of behavior on a psychological deficit or a biological need to be, suicidal, or maybe even philosophical. Something was wrong with that person. They couldn't exercise logic. So there were all these different reasons out there in academia that tried to explain suicide. However, nobody ever tried to look at the social factors for suicide. So he was going to try to show them that there were all these different social factors that did influence suicide. And his theory was that people commit suicide because they lack the social connections and the obligations to prevent them from taking their own life. So I have Durkheim's theory up at the top so you guys could look at it. And for this exercise, I'm just going to be looking at 3 of the social indicators or social factors that he looked at when he was doing his study on suicide. And the first one is religion. So usually when I have my face-to-face class, I ask them which religion is more socially integrated. When I mean socially integrated, I mean socially connected. Which religion is more socially connected? Protestants or Catholics? For those of you that do not know what Protestants are, it would be any other Christians other than Catholics. Because as you know, Catholics are Christians, but they're a different kind of Christian. They're their own denomination. And then there's all these other denominations like Baptist or Evangelical, or like Mormon. So those are all Protestant religions. So usually in my class, people say that Protestant religions are more socially integrated or more socially connected. But I always have to correct them because it's actually Catholics who are more socially integrated. And why is that? Well, here's what I tell them. I say, Catholics leave no room for interpretation or disagreement with their doctrine. They're opposed to birth control, abortion, having female priests. It's a very traditional and ritualistic religion. There's only one Catholic church, but there are many Protestant churches. And Protestant churches, they, depending on which church you go to, for example, the Episcopalian church, some churches do not allow gay individuals to be ordained ministers, while another section of the Episcopalian church does allow gay members to be ministers, openly gay individuals to be ministers. And as a matter of fact, in 2003, they had their first gay bishop, like openly gay bishop. So it shows you there that when it comes to these religions, there's all these disagreements, all these different interpretations that you can have. And in the Catholic Church, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, they're all the same. They all have the same rules. So that is why Catholic religion is a little bit more socially integrated. In terms of marital status, I always ask them, who's more socially integrated? Who's more socially connected? People that are married or unmarried? Usually everyone gets that right. Married people are more socially integrated. Why is that? Well, when you're married, you have more kinship ties. So you have your spouse, and then your in-laws, and any friends that your spouse brings with them once you get married. So all these people, your social network becomes larger, so you become more socially integrated. The last one is children. So who's more socially integrated? People with children or without? We all know that people with children are going to be more socially integrated, more socially connected, because again, they're going to have a larger network. You're going to have your children, and they're going to have little friends, and their little friends are going to have parents, and you're going to go out to parties where you're going to be with these parents. So your children do allow for you to have a larger social network, and that is why people with children are more socially integrated. So what were his findings on his landmark study on suicide, which was published in 1897? Well, he found that Protestants did have higher suicide rates than Catholics, so it definitely supported his thesis or his theory. He also found that people who were unmarried had higher rates of suicide. And lastly, he found that people without children had higher rates of suicide. So because of this, Durkheim proved that there were social factors that were influencing people to commit suicide, and he was able to establish sociology as a discipline, and he became one of the most respected people within the discipline. So, theories in sociology are propositions that explain the social world and help to make predictions about future events. Theories are also sometimes referred to as approaches, schools of thought, paradigms, or perspectives. When you hear somebody saying that's a sociological paradigm or that's a sociological perspective, they're just saying theory. That's all they're saying. They're just using a different word for it. And sociologists can use different levels of analysis to explore social relationships. In sociology, we have microsociology or macrosociology. So micro meaning small. So this examines small group interactions to see how they impact larger institutions in society. Microsociologists would look at interactions between a couple, maybe looking at the way that they talk to each other. Maybe they would look at the interactions among a sports team. So a social researcher would go and look at displays of masculinity between a football team. They might also look at the interaction between a cashier and a shopper. A macrosociologist, macro means large, so they examine large-scale social structures to determine how they impact groups and individuals. A macrosociologist, for example, would look at the economy and how it impacts consumer behavior, or how a presidential election influences American morale. So they might ask a question like, how is America responding to a Trump-Clinton, a possible candidacy? How is that affecting them, and how do they feel about it? That would be the sorts of questions that a social researcher would have. Okay, folks, so here are the three major schools of thought, and these are the three major theories that you're going to be exposed to throughout the course. The first one is conflict theory, the second one is structural functionalism, and the third one is symbolic interactionism. So that first one, I have a picture of Karl Marx at the top, and then I have Emile Durkheim and George Herbert Mead. The reason that I have their pictures at the top is because these are the influential thinkers within that school of thought, and so because they are very important, I put them there for you. And at the bottom there I have the short definitions, or like the in a nutshell definitions for you, but we're going to go over each of these theories in the next few slides. So that first theory, conflict theory, it states that society is in constant conflict because people have differing degrees of power. The second one is society is viewed as an ordered system of interrelated parts, and all those parts work together to maintain society or to contribute to society's stability. The third one is symbolic interactionism, which suggested that the meanings that we give objects in our society are social processes. So let's move on to the next slides where we can break each of these down. Okay, folks, so let's get into conflict theory. So Karl Marx was a German philosopher and theorist who came up with conflict theory. I have his picture to the right. He's also a very famous economist, and he wrote the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, which many of you might have been exposed to in your political science classes, maybe in your history classes. It's a very famous writings where he talked about socialism and communism, and it's the works where this type of political economic system was derived from. So you probably know some of these communist countries like China, Russia was previously communist, North Korea is still communist, and Cuba is still communist. And all of those countries, they are set up based on Marx's principle of a socialist society or a communist society, which is where all people share in the wealth. They're all owners of the means of production, and they are all equal in that society's eyes. So one thing that Marx did was criticize capitalism. So he felt that capitalism created these social and economic inequalities that split society into two classes, which he labeled as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. They're more commonly known as the haves and have-nots. In your textbook, I think they use that sort of terminology. But just so you know, whenever you hear somebody say bourgeoisie, proletariat, they're probably referring to Marx's criticism of capitalism. So why did he feel that capitalism was so evil? Well, you have to remember, Marx was coming of age when the Industrial Revolution was kind of at its peak, or kind of ending over in Europe, which is where he was from. And it was it was going on over here in the United States. So during that time, Marx got to see all of the labor abuses. He got to see children working in the factories. For example, I have a picture of children working in the factories here at the bottom right portion of the slide. And back then, when he was around, they didn't have any labor unions to protect the workers. There was no such thing as a 40-hour work week. There was no such thing as the weekend. If the people, the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, wanted people to work, 16 hours a day for 7 days a week, then they got their way, because there were no laws, no labor laws protecting the proletariat or the have-nots. And so he saw all of this inequality, and it just enraged him. And he said that the reason that this inequality exists is because of capitalism. It's an evil system. The bourgeoisie are in constant competition with one another to try to get the most profit. So he said that the only way that this inequality could end, this unequal distribution of resources could end, was for people to replace capitalism with socialism. And if people were not willing to replace capitalism with socialism, he predicted that capitalism would eventually self-destruct and be replaced by a socialist government or a classless society. And the way that he predicted that that would happen was that the proletariat, the have-nots, they would gain what he called class consciousness and overthrow the oppressor and create this socialist, classless society. So when people use Karl Marx's conflict theory, it's usually to talk about groups in a way where, or society in a way where it's conflict ridden, and that people are competing for scarce resources or for power. So structural functionalism is the second theory, and this is also known as functionalist theory. And it's a broad perspective that sets out to interpret society as a structure with interrelated parts. And we had talked about all these different social structures or social institutions at the very beginning of the presentation. We brought up family, we brought up education, politics, economy, religion. So all of those structures are interrelated. And each of those structures meets the needs of society by performing specific functions for the whole system. There was a famous sociologist named Herbert Spencer who likened the different parts of society to organs, and he said that just like organs in a body, they are needed to make that body function properly. Well, family, education, politics are those organs, and the body is society. So if those vital organs do not work, if the family is not functioning the way that it should and socializing its children, and if the educational institutions are not educating the children, then society is not going to flourish. It's going to be unstable. So it's necessary for all of these different institutions to work together in order to make a productive society, to make a stable society. The structures, again, that make up the different parts are the following: the family, education, religion, political institutions, economic institutions, but they are definitely not limited to those institutions. There's so many other institutions that interact to make the system stable. For example, the criminal justice system. That would be an institution that helps society keep its stability. So this last perspective is called symbolic interactionism. And with symbolic interactionism, it sees interaction and meaning as central to society and assumes that meanings are not inherent. Inherent meaning objective, that there's some sort of objective truth to anything. So these meanings are not inherent, but rather are created through interaction. So society is the product of all these different interactions between you and I, or you and other people. And the basic tenets of symbolic interactionism are: number one, we act toward things on the basis of their meanings. So I'm going to tell you a little story, a fake story actually, but just to try to illustrate symbolic interactionism. So say I go to a yard sale, and there's a little bin at the yard sale with a bunch of books in it, maybe 4 or 5 books. And I see that they have a book that I really want in there, and I go up to the person that's running the yard sale and I tell them, I really want this book. And they tell me, well, actually that whole bin is for sale. I'm selling it, a 5-for-1 deal. And they tell me, you can have it for $3, the whole bin. And I say, sure, why not? So I take the bin home and I find this book, and I have a picture of the book that I found down there. It's a book that looks kind of fancy. It has a little bit of gold etching on it, but it's written in Arabic, and I don't understand Arabic. So I'm like, it must be a fancy, a fairy tale book or a storybook. So at that point, that's what that means to me. That book is like a fairy tale book or a storybook. So number two, let's move on to number two. The meanings are not inherent, rather they are negotiated through interaction with others. So, a few days after, I noticed that my coffee table is a little wobbly, and I try to put all these different objects underneath, but it's just not working. And so then I get this book here, the one that's pictured below, and I decide to put that book between the wobbly leg and the ground. Maybe it'll stabilize my table. So once I do that, I notice that the wobbly table stops wobbling. So I say, great, I'm going to use the book to stabilize this table for right now. I'll try to find something to fix the table later. But then I invite my friend over my house, and he happens to be Middle Eastern. He knows Arabic, and he sees this book and he's outraged. He says, "Why do you have our holy book, the Quran? Why do you have the Quran as a as a wedge for your table? Why in the world would you do that?" And I'm like, "What do you mean? What is this book? What's the meaning of it?" He says, "The Quran is similar to the Bible for you Christians," because I'm a Christian. So he says, it's a similar thing to the Bible. Why would you do that? That's like our Bible. That's like the Muslim Bible. Why would you use it as a wedge for your table? And I say, "I am so sorry. I did not know that. I promise I'm not going to use it as a wedge anymore. I'll keep it up in my bookcase from now on." So you can see that he's negotiated that meaning of that book through his interaction with me. Now I don't see it as a fairy tale book or a storybook. Now I treat it like a proper, religious book. And then number 3, the meanings can change or be modified through interaction. After that meeting with my friend, I started changing the way that I thought about this book, and I actually started being a little bit more curious about it, and I started opening it up and looking at it and just inspecting it more. So after that meeting with my friend, this book became a lot more special to me. And when people come over my house, I start to tell them, "Oh, I have a Quran. Did you know what a Quran looks like? I have one. Let me show you." So because of that interaction with my friend, I now regard that book in a different way. And so that's symbolic interactionism. It's just your reality is changed by people's reactions, and the way that you see. Okay, folks, so that's the end of the presentation. I usually have this class activity that I do, but since we're not a face-to-face class, you don't have to worry about doing this activity. I hope you enjoyed the